Thank you. So very quickly to the first paper. Yang Lu's paper on ontological security. 3 quick points on first the framework that you've used, and 3 quick points on its application to India-China relations. So at the outset, I think there's, I would grant that there's a concept when, like ontological security when you apply it to international relations from sociology and psychology, there is, I would say that there is a certain amount of intuitive appeal because it pushes the discourse to look beyond physical security and to look at questions of sense of self and sense of being. But despite its intuitive appeal, I would say, let me flag 3 quick points on why I find that despite its intuitive appeal, I find 3 issues that largely puzzle me and also which I find problematic. First is really that it continues to maintain a largely state-centric focus with all its, at the end of the day, it remains a state-centric focus with all its limitations. I won't elaborate, I'll just flag because time is short. And India-China relations continue to be studied within largely statist frames, again, with all its limitations. And it does not, as a framework, give us the scope to even unbundle the state itself as an actor. It continues to largely look at, Beijing and New Delhi, as perspectives in ontological security or insecurity, as the case may be, of these 2 actors. Does not even allow us to look at subnational actors. So does not, we don't even begin scratching the surface of that. Second is, I would have liked to see a greater, or rather to go back to the intellectual origins of ontological security, back to, as you said, sociology, as greater sociological readings on security. On questions of collective insecurities that exist in India and China, both within and outside. Questions that, for instance, when we talk about when the state as a social actor, if the state as a social actor is an ontologically secure actor, does it also mean that it tends to delegitimize the security concerns of a whole bunch of social actors? Other social actors. So to that extent, I feel this may be, and Vinny Chakul's recent, not recent, paper on his formulation on others within could be useful here on how the state tends to create these categories. And as you mentioned, its roots in psychology, for instance, I think even David Lang's work on the divided self would throw very useful because Giddens actually draws a lot on that. So when you extrapolate and parachute a concept into IR, how useful is it to move immediately from the individual to the level of the state? I'm not too sure, neither am I convinced. And third is the sense of self. Again, I have my huge doubts about how far this gets us, because when you look at the idea of India itself, how much it has been based on a deeply territorial imagination. The recent book by E.T. Abraham on how India became territorial would give you a fair sense of that. Second, to 3 quick points on your routinized interactions. That is on so very quickly, what does routine do? Does routine enhance trust by facilitating risk, by incentivizing risk-averse behavior, or does routine tend to reduce trust by actually creating incentives that do not offer incentives to change the status quo, as you mentioned, and does it end up creating a holding pattern? So if which of these is happening in the India-China context, and if you were to look at just a quick example would be, how would we understand Debsang, the Debsang incursion of 2013, where you actually see a breakdown of the same routinized interactions failing to kick in for 3 weeks. So you have this eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between India and China, which goes on where the routinized interactions and do not serve the logic that they are drummed up to. And the last point, does it help us unbundle the state? What is the role of agents of state, for instance, in this case, in Debsang, of the role of military or local commanders in subverting what is the dominant security perception in both India and China? I say this because no policy change has been signaled by either Delhi or Beijing, yet at the local level, agents of state has had a certain space to maneuver and change and create uncertainty, which is just the obverse of what the premise that you started with, that routinized interactions would result in reduction of certainty and therefore trust. So that does not really work there. So it might be an interesting question for us to look at. So thank you. So
wait for that paper too. That's
oh, okay. Yeah. I just went in a.
Thank you.
So
Sanjay, unfortunately,
Sanjay can't make it
yeah.
today, right? So we'll go straight to Joe Thomas.
Yeah, you can just jump in. Yeah, thanks.
Yang Lu, I found your paper interesting because ontological security as an epistemic category, I was not previously that exposed to this, but I found it interesting the way you sort of applied it. This also made me go back to Anthony Giddens's application of the concept, which is where I then found a certain problem, particularly in the way you've applied Giddens's original concept of ontological security. And when I looked at the stated aim of your paper, I felt that it is slightly problematic the way you've applied it. Originally, Giddens would look at ontological security in terms of the confidence that most human beings have in the continuity of their self-identity. Ontological security would stress more on the constancy of the surrounding social and material environments. Ontological security would depend on a sense of reliability of persons and things, which are actually fundamental to the notion of trust. It is here that I found that your application of the concept, maybe that needs to be reworked. It's almost somebody gifting me an M-sized, a medium-sized T-shirt, and then I trying to sort of make it fit. How does the application of this concept fit in with the victim mentality of India? That was the crux of your paper, that India harbors a victim mentality. I thought it was more of a case of ontological insecurity arising out of the application of the victim mentality. Because playing victim versus the original concept of Giddens's ontological security, which talks of continuity of self-identity, I thought these are clearly at variance as concepts. So therefore, there's a need to reframe the key elements of self-identity and continuity. If I were to apply that concept in the paper, and it's a remarkable thing that you've applied an epistemic category to the scheme of events that you describe, I would basically look at the constancy coming from India looking at China as an aggressor, and China looking at India also as an aggressor with the forward policy that India pursued. So when both those countries look at each other in terms of a certain constancy, that is where I see the constancy coming from, not as India playing a victim. Because self-identity and the continuity of self-identity based on victimhood, I find that's essentially problematic as far as Giddens's original concept is concerned. A technical point, there was an error in defining the middle sector disputes in your paper. That's on page 5. The middle sector comprises proximate areas of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So that is something which is an error. Also, you mentioned the vice ministerial level talks of that happened between 1981 and 87. However, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that even before the war, talks were actually happening in the form of the joint report of officials from both India and China on border issues. This was in 1960. Why did that joint exercise fail to clarify an understanding on borders? I think that would be very interesting to look at, especially when you're defining identity of A country versus B. Figure 1, the figure that you used relating to the conflict wheel, I thought the transition between latent conflict and crisis always has an element of negotiation in between. So I felt that the conflict wheel also needs to be modified, because even in the case of India, when latent conflict was first articulated, it was followed up by negotiation, whether it was the joint report, whether it was Nehru and Chou En-lai and their bilateral efforts at trying to arrive at some sort of an understanding. I thought negotiation essentially has to be an important part of that conflict wheel. And in your conclusion, you had stated that intensified relations automatically do not lead to better mutual trust, and it should actually be preceded by historical reconciliation of the border dispute. I find it giving rise to a chicken and egg problem, because the classic liberal institutional approach would argue that intensified relations would permeate, whether it is through creation of interest groups, whether it is through avenues for signaling, it would lead to better mutual trust. But if you condition it on the basis of historical reconciliation of the border dispute first, that becomes problematic, because that again gives rise to this chicken and egg problem. Reconciliation of the border dispute has to actually flow from the kind of multiple sections of interaction and different epistemic communities that get to interact in the context of two countries. And that is what gives rise to trust. So social capital is a very important part of engendering mutual trust. Just by arguing that historical reconciliation of the border dispute should come first, I think that is the number one problem that we are dealing with. So you have to maybe tweak that part of the conclusion. So these are my 5 points of observation.
Okay, we're going to go back to Nimmi
Yeah.
on the first or Lei Ping. They're both going to comment on
Okay.
paper number 2, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Paper number two, yeah.
No, please, go ahead.
Yeah,
Right,
and
I'll
then
make
we
it
go.
very short. I'm commenting on Dr. I'm sorry, Dr. Jianfeng Li, Li Jianfeng's paper on Bisan corridor. On Bisan corridor. This is a fascinating topic, actually, I'm very interested in, and I do have some questions later on for Dr. Li. In the paper, I noticed the conclusion reached in the paper is sort of different than the slides that you showed us toward the end. You ended with a very sort of pessimistic note by saying there is no progress of the future of the BCIM corridor development. So I'm also trying to understand why you sort of made the change from the paper when it was written and today's presentation. First of all, I would like to also look at your theoretical framework. Maybe for some reason you skipped some slides that I didn't notice. So one of the questions is the money economy issue. You mentioned sort of through the political legalization and political sort of reconciliation of the border issues. You tend to say and argue that money and sort of making profit out of the Yunnan province event is one of the major concerns for the BCIM corridor implementation from the China side. So that's one of the questions that I had for you. Why would you think it is only the concern of that particularly? And second of all is through the perspective of political economy and political implementation and empowerment of this particular collaboration, sub-region, regional collaboration from track 2 to track 1, and probably could talk a little bit more later on the transformation of that as well. Thirdly is the conflicts and from the conflicts point of view to productive sort of forces potentially in the future, because from reading your paper toward the end, we tended to conclude it is a productive sort of action between these four nation states that is currently happening and would eventually lead to something more prosperous and helpful for all four nations, especially in the context of globalization, and to the world as well. So I guess I'm going to just stop here, and since Nini is going to present as well.
Okay, to follow up on what Lei Ping said, I think I think it might be useful to locate your paper within a larger context. The larger context, I would mean the entire range of sub-regional initiatives that India and China both have been taking, out of which BCIM is just one. Locate it within this larger context, and it might be useful to ask, do these add up to what I would call a sub-regional turn in Indian and Chinese foreign policies? Do these add up to what could be called a sub-regional turn in Indian and Chinese IR? So that would be the international relations, Indian international relations and Chinese IR. So would these constitute a sub-regional turn? The reason I say this is because it presents potentially a new level of analysis within which at least Indian and Chinese relations have not been studied. This is under-theorized, understudied, and uncharted territory. So that makes it even more fascinating. So that's the first. Second is I would like to see a more critical engagement with a rich body of work in, for instance, in variety of disciplines, especially in critical geography, which looks at questions of politics of space and place, which would be very useful for you when you're looking at questions of sub-regional and subnational spaces and actors. So, for instance, as I said, one is critical geography. Are we, for instance, is BCIM Economic Corridor, for instance, a project, as Cynthia Chow says, a project of comprehensibility, quote unquote, developed by administrators? So this is it's a very contested and a very contested discourse, and you would need to bring in some of these contestations into your paper on the BCIM Economic Corridor. And three sets of questions which you could look at comparative frames, because you're looking at within the four countries, you're focusing on India and China. So it might be useful to have a more comparative frame to look at a set of questions, and I'll flag three. One is you spoke about drivers, and in fact your paper, the earlier paper that Lei Ping and I saw and read, had the title as Drivers of the BCIM Economic Corridor. So when you look at drivers, would you essentially see these, again, within comparative frames, within India and China, would you see this as a top-down process or a bottom-up process? The BCIM, what role has it allowed border regions in both India and China to play in shaping this process? Because and how do they address very interestingly questions of agency for the border regions? We have on the one hand Yunnan, which is a signatory of which is an actual official signatory of sub-regional economic cooperation agreement, whereas in India a similar status is not there for the Northeast region. So there is a question of agency, there is the question of asymmetry. asymmetry, whereas you have in the BCIM, you have one Chinese partner in the BCIM, that is Yunnan, vis-a-vis 8 Indian states. And if you include, and that could be one technical correction, you've mentioned 7, it's actually 8 Indian states. And if you include West Bengal, it is 9. So you have this huge asymmetry within a sub-regional forum. So what sort of tensions and contradictions has it led between the center and local actors within India and China? And for instance, even when in the question of the contested definition of Western region, where is Sichuan in such an initiative? There's a fair amount of interest in Sichuan in joining such a sub-regional body. The second is the notion of corridor. You have mentioned in the paper that in one of the conferences, there was a strong assertion made that the Northeast should only remain a corridor. It might be useful to clarify whose view this is. Is this Delhi's? Is this the view of the Northeast? Because that just, it's like there's no one view. It's a hugely contested concept, the concept of a corridor. Or is this the concept, is this the view of a bunch of scholars? It might be useful to clarify that. And because you need to really underline that there is no one view as far as the notion of the corridor is concerned. And lastly, to look at track 1 and track 2 that you've mentioned in your paper within the larger research policy interface within India and China. Because you've mentioned at one point that when you have the pessimistic take that the process seems to be stuck, quote unquote, at the track 2 level. So what does it tell us about the respective role that track 2 has performed, particularly with reference to the BCIM? Do you see, in your personal opinion, the track 2 performing an instrumentalist function, and is it expected to be a linear progression from track 2 to track 1, or is it expected that the track 2 continues to play, even when it's upgraded to track 1, continues to play the role of a repository of ideas and an incubator? Thank you.
That's a lot of questions to answer. Okay, but let's first move to Zhang Yuan is also going to comment on the BCM corridor. You can just talk from where you sit.
Good thing is we are recording, so if, sometimes if you want some of these comments, we'll make sure that you will have access to it.
Thank you. This is a hot issue, the BCIM. As it is not my research field, I read it as a process of knowledge acquiring and enjoyed it a lot. Here I'll try to make some feedback and comments based on my own academic background. First of all, about my general impression. The structure of this article is clear. And first, the author makes a list of the important affairs related to BCIM. And in his presentation, he also added new events, that is the One Belt, One Road. Then he talks about meanings and driving forces and constraints of BCIM. The structure is great. However, it seems to me that the definition of BCIM economic corridor is not convincing enough. And it is kind of confusing how much has been done by the former scholars and which ideas are new and newly pervaded for the very first time by the author in this article. So about the definition of BCIM economic corridor, Professor Nimmi also mentioned the name of the corridor. In the article, it didn't provide a clear definition, but I'm very glad to see that he provided in the presentation. On the page 2, 1.3 of his article, the author said economic corridor is more defined, should be defined than regional operation. India, Burma, and Bangladesh economic corridor is connected to the economies of China and India, economies of the corridors through the Myanmar, Bangladesh, such a channel to achieve the interoperability. In other words, he thinks India and China are centers, while Burma and Bangladesh are corridors. However, I think this is only a one-way wishful thinking. I mean, in my opinion, economic corridor is just a metaphorical saying for the regional cooperation. There's no difference between that. And I seriously doubt that other three countries will think of the BCIM economic corridor in this way. So I checked for other materials. And according to Chen Jidong, as a Chinese scholar, he said, first, Indian scholars focus on the economic cooperation between Tibet Autonomous Region and North India and Yunnan Province in Northeast India through Myanmar. And second, Bangladesh scholars are interested in the economic cooperation between Tibet Autonomous Region and Bangladesh through India, or between the Yunnan Province and Bangladesh through the Myanmar. And third, some Chinese scholars focus on the cooperation through Yunnan Province and Myanmar to India and Bangladesh. So to sum up, which countries are economic centers and which are corridors are not definite at all. And on page 5 of his article is 3.1. The author writes, on December 5th, 2013, the Indian Council of the World Affairs Organization of BCIM Symposium participants generally agreed at the meeting that the Northeast India should only be corridor and should not become the center of the trade and investment. Here, according to the author, even some of the Indian scholars didn't take India as the center but a corridor. Hence, the meaning of the economic corridor that is stated in 1.3 of the article is very much undermined. So my suggestion on this point is, by giving one definition, the author seems to exclude other possibilities. And if the definitions varied, and the author had to choose one, then he may want to state the reason why he sticks to this opinion. And next thing is about what is new in this article. In the citation mentioned above, Chen Jidong talks about the meanings, the driving force, and constraints of BCIM economic corridor as well, which include that he thinks BCIM economic corridor has important political and security significance and is related to West and Southwest development of China. Central government's involvement will improve academic research and regional economic cooperations, the BCIM, etc. So this citation is kept in the Chinese version of the article. It's on page 2, footnote 2, but omitted in the English version. So I think the author should make it clear which ideas have already been pointed out by Chen Jidong and other scholars. There are some of the technical problems of grammatical mistakes. I'll skip that. So finally, about my suggestions. Number 1, I think maybe the author should want to add one independent paragraph to clarify the research history of the BCIM. That is, how much has been done by the former scholars and which ideas are new and newly provided for the first time by the author in this article, or what is the innovation point of this article. And number 2 is try to avoid grammatical mistakes. Number 3 is try to avoid the political slogans. I mean, I think these political slogans are supposed to appear in the newspapers, but not in the academic writings. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Rigorous. We've got a machine gun load of questions. Okay, we'll just move to the next paper. We'll go by, the papers. So Sanjay, you first comment on the number, paper number 3.
Very grateful to EC, to Ashok, all the colleagues at the India-China Institute for doing me this honor. Great privilege and pleasure to have this opportunity to share some suggestions on these two excellent papers. I think what I will do is to sort of offer a few suggestions which might be of use as these two wonderful papers are revised in the direction of a final publication. Let me start with two comments which I think are relevant for both the papers. One is that the strengths of the arguments would have been multiplied many-fold had there been a more visible engagement with pertinent scholarly literature. One does find a few references, but it would be useful to have a clear idea. Second is that the methodological sections of the papers could be further strengthened. Now let me come to the specifics, starting with Marina's paper, and then I'll go to, because I was asked to comment on 2, and then come to Amit's paper.
Focus on 3 first, and then we'll go to 4, come back to you.
So I start with Amin's paper.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Don't mind.
I'll do that. Most certainly,
Yeah.
I'll do that. Now, I mean, it's a great paper, but let me start on a more poetical note, which is Baba Farid, 12th century Muslim mystic, who said, "I'm neither Hindu nor Muslim. Let us sit in the spinning part and abandon pride, since the Lord dwells in every heart. I have renounced to be either a Hindu or a Turk." Now, or a Turk. Now, I think this reference to mystique Sufism, which is your fourth form for discussion, is very important. And I would like to see more being said and written on that. Maybe, as you revise the paper, you could begin with that before exposing us to a very complex geographical politics behind the revival of Sufi shrines in the Indian Punjab. And I'm saying this with emphasis on one distinction which I think is very crucial, that is the distinction between Sufism and Sufi shrines. Because one finds that the geographies of Sufism are closer to what Diana Ick has mentioned in a book, that more in terms of networks and pilgrims. And I think you also talk about it when you say that when you talk about the shrines, you have to look at specific shrines in the context of larger networks. So I would urge you to please go through or think through when you make the statement Sufism as a Islamic school of thought, quote unquote. The reason being that, as one of your slides showed very graphically, that you have a very rich mix of icons and iconographies. You're looking at Bhakti movement, you're looking at Gokhina traditions, you're looking at Sikh temples. So there is a very complex iconography, sort of network of iconography. The second is that if that is the case, then is the word paradoxical revival appropriate expression? Is it a paradox, or, as I said, a very complex interplay between the ethical aspects of Sufism and the politics, or a very complex geographical, sociological politics of the revival of these Sufi shrines? Because after all, as Iftiaq Ahmed, whose book on partition you might like to engage, reminds us that pre-partition Punjab had excellent legacy of communal harmony, Sufi, Gorakhnathi Bhakti, and Sikh Guru teachings. So when you make a reference to partition, one way of bringing partition, logics of partition, could well be that Sufism also questions that. It enables you to transcend the geopolitics and the legacies of partition. My next point is that as you talk about these different forms of Sufi shrines, I think your emphasis on the Dalit shrines is very appropriate, because I think the revival of Sufi shrines has to be seen in the context of a very complex political economy of contemporary Indian Punjab. You are looking at a situation, for example, on the one hand, when you make a reference to neoliberal, and I think your neoliberal argument needs to be strengthened further. You're looking at an agrarian economy in crisis. You are looking at a very widespread sense of alienation. You are looking at the landless Dalits seeking more spaces from where they could articulate and engage with the architectures of domination. So I think if you focus more on mystique form of Sufism on the one hand, and then say more about the ways in which these spaces are used for articulation by the marginalized communities. And finally, as I said, it would be very interesting to bring out a interplay or tension between deras and shrines, right? So, because I think that is one aspect which has not received much attention. Professor Ronki Ram's work, to which you make a reference, I think deserves greater attention. And then flowing from that work, you could probably raise a few issues which will allow you to expose this very complex politics going on between the deras and the shrines in Punjab today. Thank you.
Okay. You come back to the next papers, but now we move to the next commentator, Professor Eiko Ikegami.
Yes.
Sorry,
Thank you. It's very nice to see the old faces a very sort of family-like feeling already I began to have. And Sanjay has already gave the great comments, and I just added to it. The Eamon's whole project of dissertation is very, very appropriate for this ICIs, particularly for the probably after the second phase of the ICI that go even expanding its horizon to the border areas that I understand Joe's works and so forth, that has a lot of interesting interactions, because the Eamon's dissertation's main focus is actually the Pakistan part of Punjabi and Sufism, and this is actually very dense ethnographical work. And this Indian case serves as a comparative case, but can be, of course, as an independent paper as a subject-wise. So this is actually ideal, really ideal sort of laboratory in historical sociology. Once it's basically Punjabis and populated largely in Sufis and so forth, but the history of partition sort of artificially created the boundaries, and the both curious ways Sufi shrines thrive and develop into the different forms, which by itself is so interesting. And the secondary, it is very interesting work in terms of the indigenous is not the right word, but you know what I mean. It's not a Western application of the concept and theory to India or Pakistan, but rather try to sort of from the ground, trying to get some kind of the theoretical concepts and the contribution. It's particularly interesting to see Islam as quite often from the Western viewpoint in sociology of religion mostly made through the Christian notion in which the church as the center of the authority, concentrated public power, and the ideology. And that sort of the model is transferred to understand Islam in the West. The recent fundamentalism and so forth all actually exaggerate that tendency. But in fact, if you see the South Asia, and also East Asia too, that hundreds of thousands of shrines exist. And as Sanjay rightly said that the Sufis, the shrines, and Sufi shrines are different. But it is in fact actually that sort of the dynamic of interrelationship that really make interesting. So the interesting potential contribution, once he does very well, of course, will be actually to develop the critique to the notion of the religion itself through this kind of focusing on the lived and the practice aspect of religion or spirituality or whatever you call it in Asia in general and elsewhere. So having said that, then it's also actually very good possible critics to the Sufism, which is the subject of romanticization in the Western world. So having said that, I was, there's a few critics based upon his writing rather than presentation, because the presentation, the pictures quite often almost compensate the complexity of your writing, which is very dense, very good but very dense. And then when you publish something that you address to the people who, like myself, who knows nothing about Sufism, and the complicated names and concept and history, quite often you are required to have even more writing very logically in articulated ways. And sometimes your dense writing, that like page 3, you have the more than one page of the one paragraph. Sort of the very densely, that doesn't help so much. And I think you know it. And once you show the picture, it actually, it's much more clear, what you're trying to say. But I would suggest to think through the writing styles and the accessibility to the non-specialist. And it's about also the more explicit about the method would help. You have ethnography, but not detailed contextual description, and the history plays a lot more important role in this particular chapter. And I think it is, even as an independent paper, comparison with your Pakistan case might actually illuminate if you want to publish this as an independent chapter. So it may be actually, it may, when you rewrite some logic, it may help to include it, that kind of comparative, the more explicit differences into areas. And again, I agree with Sanjay that Delhi part is very, very interesting. And your Pakistan part work focus on one of the chapters, the role the gypsies and the third gender people populated in Sufi shrine, and the places that Islamic has much more hegemonic power. So that, but the shrines as a way to incorporate urban marginals, make it very clear. And the Delhi involvement has such possibilities here. And I would like to know more. And again, I guess Ronki Ram's work, and which is more Hindu sort of the renewal of new religion almost, is a good comparison. So this part, again, can be a kind of independent theater. Very, very interesting, and it makes me think that what's the meaning of the sacred and what the power of the sacred. And eventually, I hope you will clarify what's the mechanism of power that creates this kind of the particular spaces, and what's our renewed understanding of the power of the sacred in modern world.
Thank you. And the last commentator is Barnali Chanda.
Yes. I'm gonna really like reading your paper.
Can you read it to have the recording? Sorry.
I loved reading your paper because it was a long back. I read about Sufism, and I was reading about all this, and then this sacred geography, that kind of a topic is very, very relevant and contemporary also, as it portrays the impact of socio-political and cultural transformation of a sacred space in religious context. Indeed, one of the primary ways to track the geographical and historical spread and the survival of a particular religion in Asia especially is by focusing on the creation, use and transformation and revival of the sacred sites. I feel that this paper, I just want to build on this. I mean, I don't have to, I don't know much about the, I don't want to comment on paper, critically comment on your paper, but I feel that your paper has a potential for further development and therefore can be compared to the Chinese sacred geography and its emergence and transformation. This is also a very new kind of a topic and very important topic that is happening. Why I want this? Because this emergence of sacred geography, this emergence, and then the transferring sacred geography to different places, and also then the reapproaching to that sacred geography. This kind of a phenomena is it is common in Asia. It's happening these days. So I feel that recently China saw that revival and restoration of religious and historical shrines and monasteries, and the contemporary Chinese government looked
went into history to locate these places where several legendary and historical sacred spaces could have been situated. Thereafter, in the last few decades, this emergence was very, wide. So I just wanted to know about that. Have you ever looked into the role of the government in the revival of Sufi shrines in India or in Pakistan also? And also because I think this is one of the government might encourage this kind of a revival, because liberalism in both Sufism and Buddhism helps integrating minorities and also the common people, and because it's a way to connect, way to connect the others. So maybe I can ask a question here also, that is that a reason that such kind of revival is happening these days? This is one, and then the methodology follows a very pragmatic approach, I must say, and and you represented the argument through case studies and interviews, which is really pleasant to read. I would like to know more about the reasons, as in like why like a particular place is like a mazar is becoming such a mazar or shrine is becoming such an important space for those who are always looked down upon, who are like Dalits and these minorities, and they are. Your paper told me that they are. Some of them have been converted to Islam, and they are coming, and they are. So this is also a space where they are coming and getting together, and they are, maybe it's a space for conversation also, so they can exchange, a space for exchange also. So I think as of now that is what I wanted to tell. That's it. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now we'll move to the last paper by first getting back to Sanjay.
Can you pass that off, please? Yeah, thank you. Because we are recording.
Thank you. Reading this very, very interesting paper, fascinating, I was reminded at the very outset of this new debate between the geoeconomics and the geopolitics. It's starting from Lutwak and then all these conversations that have followed. And I said to myself that your paper is a very, very powerful reminder that these debates have been there for a long time. And one has to, and that's my point, that if your paper, possibly if you could think of starting your paper by talking about this debate between geopolitics and geoeconomics, and then bring us to your analysis, which then reminds me of the following. Number one, I think your paper shows us that when you talk about capitalism, or capital expansion, you're not looking at one logic. Also, sometimes in your paper, it appears that you tend to talk about one logic and then the other logic. But running through your argument is the fact that you're talking about entangled logics, not just different logics, but these logics are entangled. So there is a logic of space, territory. There is a logic of capital. There is a logic of race. And therefore, your analysis shows us that when you talk about capitalism and population flows, and you have very rightly pointed out that we need to go beyond these conventional conceptual understandings of migration, for example, then I think that also reminds us of another very important factor. And I think you could probably do that early on, which is that when you talk about the age of unequal treaties, what do we mean by unequal? And I think one aspect of that unequalness lies in the very logics and the way in which, and this is where I think the role of power and politics comes in, the way in which at a particular juncture of history, the centers of power push certain logics and make certain logics more compelling and more visible as compared to the other logics. So your phrase, grammar of capitalism, I like that. But I think in that grammar of capitalism, we have contexts, we have texts, and we have these, as I said, highly convoluted at the same time highly contested but entangled logics. So my humble suggestion would be that age of unequal treaties, I think that concept itself needs to be revisited, because I think it is possible to say that the age of unequal treaties, or the era of unequal treaties, is not yet over. Because I was also reminded of the fact that this phrase unequal treaties is being used even today in various contexts and in various references. So maybe rather than ending on a historical note, if the concluding parts of your research could also show us as to how in the more recent phases of unequal treaties, what kind of entangled logics do we see at place. I was also wondering whether the word language, when you talk about the language of the treaties, could be further spelled out, that it's not just a language, but this language is also reflective of, as I said, various competing logics and the power play. So I think I will stop at that, and then during the Q&A I can raise a few more points. Thank you.
Okay, and the next one is Parcel.
Can you pass that please?
So, thank you. So thank you, Marina. This is, the paper was clear, pleasure to read, which of course makes life more interesting for you, because then if you sort of get a sense of what somebody has written, then you tend to have a lot of questions about it. So, like Sanjay, I like the framing, I like the grammar story. So let's see what we can do with it, right? So first, if it is grammar for what kind of language? So is this, in your paper, and understandably, the language was one essentially between US, China, UK, China kind of story. But you mentioned briefly in your oral remarks about, in your presentation about India. So does this threefold structure that you have put together, how well does this travel? Does this travel your issues of guarantees for territorial access, affirmation of geopolitical positioning, and collaboration and employment of human populations, of local populations? When you look at the number of treaties that happens prior to this in India, because that's the first area of engagement, there are also treaties that happen between European powers and, let's say, Latin America. And then there is, of course, post the Chinese story, the fairly large engagement with Africa. So if you are going to sort of carry this grammar kind of meme, then you may want to buttress this with, or at least examine how well this thing travels. And why, while on the topic, why does one want to limit this only to, let's say, quote unquote, colonial interactions? You have trade agreements being struck between great powers. And so what kind of language does that carry? Right? Is this, and the reason I'm asking this is the question as to, are these personal securities that are being sought as a result of this? Because you begin your paper with this example of these people being arrested in the context of the Opium War, and then traders naturally being somewhat unhappy about trading in a country where somebody can just pick them up and throw them in prison. Are these the kinds of things that worry them in conversations between the Germany and UK, for instance? Or so is this sort of dialogue therefore born out of a certain specificity, of a certain specific set of uncertainties, or is this something that's broader? And if it were broader, then I think your relationship to capital then becomes stronger if it comes through in that fashion. The second is the long shadow, right? The long shadow, which of this kind of stuff on the where shadow that you have passports, you have visas, you have work permits, you have the F1s and the J1s and the H1s and the various stuff floating around, which is essentially a shadow of the reaction to this free movement. And so today, you now have, let's say, the current story on this is the GATS Mode 4, when you're talking about provision of services by physical presence. And I'm not saying that this is something that should be in the paper, but since you are doing a thesis on that kind of story, and you did mention that as part of the larger project on migration, are these kinds of issues being looked at? And if they are being looked at, the question is the one part of your paper frames this as a union versus business, a labor versus capital kind of story. It's almost like the restrictions on migration are sort of almost a Polanyian double movement of labor against what kind of capital kind of story structure is coming through. Is this the right framing? If I were to ask you, would you go with this framing for looking at examining these, what is currently the shadow of these kinds of structures? Third, and this is the question that I'm not quite clear in the paper, which is the reciprocity in the right of residence. And the reciprocity in the rights of residence is something that comes up in your paper during the Burlingame Treaty in 1868, right? The previous ones that you showed in your slide, which is the 1842 and 44, the Nanking and the US Treaty, those they make in some sense, I could argue that your framing of migration as circularity versus residence is a framing. I could argue that the framing of 1842 and 44 is more about circularity, whereas 1868 is more about residence. And I don't get a sense as to what is driving this movement. Or do you think that this is an important movement? And if so, or is it merely a token gesture to inequality that the ambassador makes to sort of get certain concessions, which then has unintended consequences? So in thinking through this, I was wondering whether you had the opportunity to look at archival material about how these treaties were formulated. The kind of notings and discussions and back and forth between the ambassador and his home country as to why he is asking for certain things, and that conversation might give us a sense of what is it that's driving these kinds of structures. So that I think would be interesting if you could sort of add that to that particular story. And finally, I was very, I find this a very nice note, which is we have this consul in Hong Kong talking about how, because you have now imposed restrictions on travel and only merchants can travel freely, how various people are now posing, quote unquote, as merchants, right? And it reminds me today that, you also have, let's say, in a variety of, since it's easier in some sense for students to get visas and things for travel nowadays, there are all these, quote unquote, fake schools, which sort of get opened up, and then people start applying and traveling. So not much changes between 1912 and 2015. So it's nice to see that kind of structures coming through. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And the last one is Jingfeng.
Jingfeng, do you mind going to?
Can we move over?
Or
We need
Years?
to. Oh, yeah. Maybe. Thank you.
migrating microphones.
Migrating. Through the economic corridor.
Thanks for Marina's presentation. It's a very good presentation about use many historical data and taxes. And I think in your describe Chinese migration, it's use more data. I think it's more better. But I know it's difficult to collect this data. If you can find some, I think it's better. Secondly, and recently I read a book about Mahan's book. That book was described in the 19th century, and U.S. policy was not the focus was not the east of Asia. It's focused the American. North American. So in your paper, I think use the international relationships study. I think it's better. That's all.
Okay, so I'm glad at least we have 30 minutes instead of 60 minutes. But let's just see, do we have the presenters to briefly
Invite the
respond?
presenters, take maybe 2-3 minutes or anything.
Yeah, but really 2 or 3 minutes, because we have more questions coming in.
I think the goal is to get more, as much feedback from people, but if there are 1 or 2 things that you want to come and respond to.
Yeah, so let's start by Yang Lu. Let's
Again,
just.
use the microphone, please.
Okay, this is not migrated. This is not migrated. It doesn't want
Thank you very much for Nimmi's comments, and so maybe better with this. Yeah. So just so go through the main points that you raise. Here, I would you say that my paper is too much state-centric. Still, the framework. It's very state-centric, and so we have a different level of analysis, because you say that the domestic actors, the key is the domestic actors is also so ignored in this the paper, and I think that that you have different level of analysis. So. There is the state level. There is a problem that apply the psychological concept, which is based mainly on the individual level, to the state level. But I mean, we have. But state is also collectivity of individuals. So we really. Yeah, only 1 minute. Okay, good. So then if we. This is why to apply, there should be problematic, but otherwise, how can we do this? So this is still some international relations. We talk about relations between states, and still we try to find similarities to explain why human agents, why human agents act like this way. And so this is so because my paper cannot cover everything, and to your comments, so on the victimhood problem. So I mean maybe so in your it depends on how we perceive the things. So I think you think that is problematic, but I think you just look at the discourse that in the 1962s, look at white papers that Nehru's in the decision-making things. What he try to communicate with the general public is that, and then the wide consequences. And China was criticized as aggressor, and it really happens in the psychology that they say that it's victim because we treat you well, we supported you in many issues in the international systems. Why you treated like the things that decision making is one thing, but there needs compromise, and there needs the political practice is something different, and the chicken eggs questions. I mean that historical intensified exchanges doesn't necessarily lead to the better trust. We can start with that because we have to start with this intensified relations first. But that does not necessarily or automatically lead. That chicken and eggs, it's a condition. But at the same time, we have also think about some other ways to broaden our minds and to bring some other perspective in, to think about another perspective focused on the historical reconciliations, bring other states actors. So it's a pity that in my paper I cannot cover so much aspects on it, but I quite agreed with you that states, the actors within states, I have to put more focus on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for Lei Ping's questions. I think your first question is very good. I explain in two levels. Firstly, for Indians' foreign levels, I thought Indians, especially Modi's foreign relationship each day. Because I'm a scholar for these areas. And recently I noticed Modi's from look east to act east. This in some discontent for contradiction for China's BCIM. And in his foreign policies, I think India and China's relationship in recent days was competing and cooperation. But in the BCIM areas, competing is more important. Secondly, is for security reasons. And recently, many Xinjiang areas, Uyghur people. This person was from Yunnan and to southeast countries, and from that countries to the Middle Asian, they were anti-China government. So China want to develop effections in BCIM areas, but especially security areas. But this will affect Indians' security in northeast areas. So it's contradiction. Can't to cooperate. So I changed my opinions for these two levels. And secondly, for Nimmi's question was yes, I know. Question was very good. And firstly, for Sichuan, I attending many meetings about the South Silk Road and many Silk Road about Sichuan cooperation with India. But this meeting and in national level meetings don't have specific actions. They all said we need cooperation, but how to cooperation? No one can clear it. So I was. Secondly, about the track 2 and track 1, in my opinion, I think now Yunnan's track 2 is more better. Track 1 was in 2 years ago, that was for the National Congress Party. That's for its competition for general elections. So now BJP was win the elections. So the BCIM was not very important to India. That's my opinion. So I think Yunnan and cooperation with northeast of India or other places like Sichuan cooperation that areas, and we all government or Sichuan government courage or companies to invest that areas. But this cooperation or investment, FDI, not belong to the BCIM economic corridor. I think BCIM economic corridor, not regional corporations, because regional corporations include many things about the infrastructure and many things can code regional corporations. In my economic corridor, it's only include infrastructure and energy corporation and through the corridor and developed through corridor areas economic development, not the regional development. I think, in my opinion, was this. About your question, in fact, and my paper, my study was for the leaders, for the youth. So I don't need to tell the leaders, one scholar said this, other scholar said that, or other scholar said that. And in my study, I think about the BCIM corridor, about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and Chen Jidong is my professor. So we studied these areas 10 years ago. I think we was familiar with these areas. We don't use other people's opinions, but we know other people think, like Nimmi's institute, about their institute's opinion about the BCIM, and Pakistan's about their opinions about China-Pakistan's economic corridor. We know this, but we don't about to say many about their opinion. We only say about all opinions. What's our opinion, and why I can conclude my opinion. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And next one, I guess it's
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for all the comments. I think I'll start with the Sufism and shrine relationship that both Sanjay and Eiko have flagged. I mean, I think that this is something that I keep struggling with myself. That I think, as Eiko pointed out, this kind of dynamic and relationship between Sufism and shrine. And I find myself that when I'm in the US, I use the word Sufi much more than when I'm not, when I'm in South Asia, because in general terminology, people, especially in Pakistan, don't actually refer to Sufi too frequently. But they do refer to Islam. And I think there is a sort of debate within the Sufi community, or you can say the community of shrines, as to the significance of Islam to the shrine itself. So in many cases, especially in Pakistan, of course, the kind of legitimacy that I didn't get a chance to talk about, that the power of the sacred brings in the particular socio-political context, is sort of premised on, defining the shrine as the kind of legitimate form of Islam. Whereas if you look at the Indian case, there is, again, I think there's two perspectives here. There's one that sees, like Oberoi, for example, Harjit Oberoi, who sees sort of this fluidity between religious boundaries in the Punjab region. And then there's other argument which is more about transcending religious boundaries rather than sort of mixing everything up. And I think I would agree with the former kind of perspective on this, because even if you see sort of the iconography, it is actually very clear that which icon sort of connects with which particular religious tradition. So the radical part of this for me is that, of course, it's all existing in the same space, but actually it is the presence of multiple religious traditions in the same place, rather than sort of the merging of them all together into some kind of new form altogether. So I suppose that if you look at sort of how religions sort of transform and so forth, there might be sort of different stages to it. So, sort of this emphasis on clearly defining religion and sort of clearly defining its boundaries is sort of this 19th century onwards, this phenomena that you see. in a way, what you see in the shrine itself is no longer about simply dismissing the boundary either. So the boundary, in a sense, still exists, but there is a possibility of transcending it, which is now considered to be legitimate and so forth. But in some cases, you still also see that kind of mixing and so on. So it is, I think, complicated in that sense. I totally agree with this, the criticisms on the writing style for non-specialists and the parts of methodology and so on that are missing from the sections. In terms of the question of the state, the one part that I didn't get to in the presentation is not just a state in the form of the legislature and the government institutions, but also the state in the form of bureaucrats and the state in the form of individuals, and how they sort of, the shrine in a way, or some of these sort of more eccentric figures the godmen that I talked about in the end, the kind of role that they play in these new kinds of networks. So the state, in terms of its policy, I discussed in the Pakistan section that the state is actively trying to sort of transform the shrine. But in the Indian case, I think what's more interesting is that the state, in the form of various actors, bureaucrats, political figures, and so on, and how these shrines, in a way, connect these various kinds of networks and allow these peers or godmen to act as sort of intermediaries between these various branches of the state and the economy and so forth, and allow them to sort of intervene in these.
So the last one's Marina.
Thank you very much for all the comments. I think I will have an excellent opportunity now for postdoctoral research on migration flows and the logics of capital, sponsored by the ICI. Excellent. So just to sort of respond to maybe respond or maybe comment on the comments, I really appreciate the idea of entangled logics. And I absolutely agree that this is what I'm actually going to use that term, if you don't mind. This is exactly what's happening with all these treaties and the way in which the interactions actually develop. And to the question that Partha had about how the treaties were formulated, I did look at a lot of the documents related to the formulation of the treaties. My own interest is not so much in the formulation, but how they are interpreted, how people can actually use whatever the language of the law is in order to make their own case for it. So what is quite interesting for me is taking that stale language of the law and using it in order to challenge certain negotiations, certain aspects of injustice, let's say. But the formulation of the treaty, back to the question, is very interesting because it shows exactly this entangled logics where what the Qing government, for example, was negotiating with the US was not necessarily conducive to migration. The Qing government would often use the migration card for geopolitical purposes, for example, to negotiate Manchurian interests in Manchuria at that time. So it's fascinating, the construction of the treaties, not just the initial, the 42-44, but throughout that period of 50 years of unequal treaties. And it's on the question of power, it's again very difficult to say, oh, the power is with the Western countries or all the power is with one government, because different actors can play different cards for different reasons, with, of course, the people who are affected the most having no place at the negotiation table, but at the same time having the opportunity to then reinterpret whatever is said by the law. So that's what I find fascinating. Just one last comment on U.S. positioning in the Pacific. It depends who you read. right? So there are a lot of different scholars. Some will say U.S. had no interest in the Pacific. Others will challenge that opinion. What I usually go by and what I like to sort of argue is clear U.S. interests in the Pacific is the takeover of the Philippines and Hawaii. Right? So, yeah, I'll stop on that. They were not that benevolent.
Okay, we can definitely continue this now. We'll just open up the floor for anyone. Gentleman here first.
Maybe you want to take a bunch of questions just so that they get 3-4 questions.
Should we do that? Just bunch as they come.
Yes, this is Prabhakaran, an alumnus of the New School. Whatever I'm going to say, I'm not saying it as a spokesman for the Indian government, okay? If you are looking for a critique of some of the policies adopted by the Indian governments, starting from the Nehru government coming up to the Modi government, count me as number one. Some of the principles. So my first comment is on what Dr. Yang Lu's presentation, and I'll make a minor point on Dr. Jaffer, something that Dr. Jaffer said. The main observation that I have is that I accept the fact, accept your statement that India was defeated in the 1962 war. India was. But India was not expecting a war. India was caught napping. India even felt betrayed because until then, Indians were singing about that Panchashila principles adopted by Chow and Lai and Nehru. They were going cheek by jowl until that time. So never did Nehru think that there would be a violation of those principles, A. B, there was a theoretical border, a border accepted in principle, McMahon line, that was a British general. I hope you're aware of that. No? Anyway, there was a British general called McMahon. He drew up a line, and I'm not aware of any international theory making it legal under international law, but it was theoretically accepted. And again, Nehru never expected that to be violated. Okay, so this Panchila and the violation of that McMahon line, this was the reason that India was defeated, and it was Nehru's policies came under severe criticism by the Indian media. You only said about the Indian media supporting the Indian government's views. No, there was they were equally opposed also to many of the policies adopted by the Indian government vis-a-vis China. That's about it. Then Dr. Jaffer, a minor point. When you said the secular principle stand debunked or something like that, you said? In theory, the theory got debunked in India. There were violations, of course. There are fanatics in all religions. Majority being Hindus, 850 Hindus, you will see many fanatics, of course, more fanatics than in any other religions. They have been violating the principle, but secularism, if any Indian government violates that principle or accepts any policy opposed to that, in violation of that, that Indian government will not survive more than a short period. So that's the main thing we all have to keep in. Indian government, maybe Modi, maybe BJP or whatever, it doesn't matter. The principle of secularism, that was the founding principle of India. India will not survive once that principle is debunked. Anyway, that's...
Okay, can I quickly also throw in something myself? Okay, just very quickly, I do now understand Dr. Li's response that this is originally a paper for the Chinese leadership, whatever. But I do wanted to also second what Zhang Yuan said. When I was reading that paper, I was totally confused about what BCI is not being a member of either the government or the area experts, right? So I think for this kind of purpose, you do have to, maybe it's good to state at the very beginning what the concept is, BCI. But then really, I was really fascinated by Marina's paper, and I just wanted to get it even more maybe entangled. And following on Parthel's long shadow remark, if you could push the long shadow backwards and forward even more, I think it's really fascinating, because the long shadow back was, you know, this whole thing about unequal relationship and treaty being subverted by the other side had a prehistory of, you know, like at least 50 years before. I don't know if you've heard of this big fat book by a French diplomat and historian, Humphrey. I think this was called the Immobile Empire. Of course, the empire there was the Qing dynasty, and it was a, you know, description of this really famous Lord Macartney's mission to Qianlong, and there was totally unequal relationship the other way around. You know, Lord Macartney had to kneel down, and he didn't want to because he thought he was an equal, you know, representative of the King of England. The other empire, which the Qing Empire was totally oblivious and looked down upon as the red-haired barbarians, right? And so there was this whole drama of, you know, the king, the one empire receiving the barbarians, you know, from the other side. And of course, you know, 50 years later, it was completely turned around, and it was the Chinese being brought down to its knees. Totally surprised, right? And then the forward shadow, I would say this whole thing about the Exclusion Act was one of the most probably humiliating and notorious racist act in the early U.S. History. And it had, you know, a follow-up. I mean, I think it was one of the probably the latest to be, you know, formally abolished up till, I can't remember, U.S. Congress. 1942, very recent. So it was there for a long time, right? And even the latest follow-up, I think, was there was a demonstration where that theme was brought up again by the Chinese communities in the U.S. It was, I think, against a TV show, Jimmy, I can't remember his last name, but it was a show, a popular show on U.S. television. This was like a year or two ago, about a kid in answering the question said, "Oh, the Chinese, there's so many Chinese now, you know, and of course now they have lots of money too." And the kid just happened to answer, "Oh, just kill them," you know. And this really triggered off a demonstration among the U.S. New immigrants communities, which are otherwise not very active, and so they really felt they need to stand up. And in that demonstration, I think that Exclusion Act was brought up again. So there was really a long shadow over, you know, more than a century of entangled battles back and forth, you know. So it's just fascinating. Let me get to Parthel.
So quickly, three things on three papers. First, I would, it was sort of there, but it would be nice to get a sense, since you're looking at this issue, Yang Lu, about the extent to which media drives policy. Right? Because a lot of the stuff is not so much, people think, especially in China, about media representing the opinion of the state. But in many places, especially India, and I think also in China for that matter, because there is now in China not just the media, but also this huge online feed, right? So to what extent does media drive policy in that stretch, if looking at ontological structures? Secondly, on the BCIM, three quick questions, because I wasn't quite following. I completely lost you when you said something about the political compulsions of elections towards this whole BCIM story. I mean, because usually Indian elections, there is zero impact of anything international. And I'm just curious as to what analysis you are bringing to that particular story. Secondly, a comparison between the China-Pakistan corridor and the BCIM. And as you rightly said, there is an issue here about multiple countries and single countries, and what the complexities that are involved. Finally, a quick thing. I understand that, I mean, Nimmi, of course, is better stuff on this than I am, because I don't do this at all, is the BCIM was upgraded in I think in 2011 or 12, from being just track 2 to last year. Okay, last year. Now, and how does this square with your doom and gloom kind of structure? I mean, why would you want to upgrade something that you want to ignore? And I'm not quite sure where that is coming from. Finally, I mean, there is two kinds of things, three kinds of things. One is this one that comes out from your response, which is this whole issue about co-located but not intermingled, right? You said, and sort of, I hear you this whole thing of the salad versus melting pot kind of story, right? And if you want to elaborate on that, I wasn't sure I got you when you're saying that kind of structure. Second, as you're seeing these revivals of these shrines, who are the priests? Are they merely being occupied as spaces, or do they also remain Sufi spaces? Especially since you say that in Pakistan the Sufi stuff doesn't sort of, because is not as visible in that sense, or not as oral in there. And third, I mean, in India, I mean, my relationship, my knowledge, my fact that I know there is something Sufi, apart from learning Kabir's poems in school, is the fact that is music, right? And Shah Hussain, from your own city, is recently, for example, Vasundhara Das did a huge Shah Hussain project, and it's an ongoing project on music about their stuff. I mean, then obviously Rabbi Sher Gill and the Bulle Shah stories, etc. So a lot of the Sufi sexiness comes with its association, at least to the younger minds, with music. And what kind of role do you see in that space?
I have two questions for Dr. Liu Yang, and another one about Sufi, so first of all, for Dr. Liu, I was wondering, on your last slide, you were talking about the European context of reconciliation, and I was wondering what you see are the differences between that context to India, China. And when I ask this question, I'm thinking about the differences in terms of geography, the geographical connections and links between the two countries, the economic differences. So basically, trying to figure out why and how you think the India-China relationships, and that can learn something from the European context of reconciliation, and just trying to understand why and how you see that happening. The next question for Amin, I'm just curious about the individuals that you interviewed about Sufi shrine revival. What do they think? What are the interesting stories that you discovered when you were trying to learn more about the Sufi shrine revival?
So the people who are part of the community?
Yes.
Okay, I think whoever wants to respond to open. We have a few minutes, right?
1 minute. We want to make sure we get a lunch. Yeah, Alan, you want to do that? I don't know. Anybody, you don't have to respond. 1 minute? Yeah, you have one. You're the last, right? And then you will have the last one.
Okay. Well, I have a whole chapter on the performative. Let me start with your last point. Because the way I'm sort of seeing the power of the sacred is sort of in three different dimensions. One is in terms of the kinds of networks that it is, it sort of, you could say, the way networks overlap in particular kinds of religious spaces. And second is the performative dimension. So I look at actually rituals and of course music and also certain dance forms being a central part of it. So I have a whole chapter on that, which in 30 seconds that I have now left would be difficult to address. And the priests, again, each shrine form has its own kind of genealogy of the peers. That's the words. So in some cases, it's people who actually connect themselves through their sort of bloodlines or through their spiritual lines to certain Sufi peers. In other cases, it is very charismatic godmen who actually don't have a Sufi genealogy at all, but that's why I was saying that they're missing that sort of Sufi element, because for Sufis you have to have this genealogy sort of central to it. But they sort of...
this is not being sort of, let's say, acquired by traditional Islam or more mainstream versions of Islam in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, they might not even be Muslims. I mean, most of them are not actually.
They wouldn't be like Wahhabis taking over the
No. Wahhabis would just destroy the shrines. Yeah, they would not. Yeah.
It's a space with a
Right.
variety of structures, land, all of that stuff is valuable.
Right. No, there are cases in Lahore. You see cases of Wahhabis actually trying to like raise down the shrine and replace it with the mosques. Yeah, that's happening in.
Taking the space over, not necessarily.
Yeah, not the institutional form. And finally, the question of
would you call that revival?
destroying, sort of taking over the space. But then the shrine it's no longer the shrine. I mean, they would even sort of construct on top of the grave. I mean, they're doing that in Makkah, for example. They don't care even for Muhammad's grave and that sort of thing. So there's no longer then sort of shrine is out of the picture. And what do individuals and community members, their voice? I mean, this is again really difficult to sum up, but I think there is a lot of sort of excitement, or sort of you could say intensity about shrines right now, which is what really takes you by surprise initially, because it's not that these individuals are giving up their Hindu or Sikh identities, but they even might change their names. So they might attach a Sufi lineage order to their name. So so they have a very sort of strong identification, many of them, with the shrines. I'll tell you more about this when we can chat more, because there's of course a whole range of ways in which their lives are transformed by engaging with this tradition.
Actually, very quickly, it just occurred to me, there's one more spinning possibility there, but it's an open. I can't remember whether you mentioned open door. Zhang Jie's open door policy leading to, decades later again, to Deng Xiaoping's open door, and those are in some ways are kind of uncanny reactions to each other, because the U.S. open door policy was because the American was a latecomer, right? The empire competing with all these other British in particular, so they're not just interested in the Philippines. I think at that point they wanted to have their cut of market in China, so it's in their interest to frame this in this legal contracts and whole policy, right? But that created, in a way, a reaction in the Chinese Revolution later to shut down that door completely. So we had a closed door kind of country for 50 years almost, until the open door policy in China's Chinese terms. So that's interesting. But I think we have to end here, but to be continued during lunch and afternoon. It's been, I think, a very productive, interesting, stimulating morning session.